Kale leaned over his polished work surface, holding his breath as he nudged the shallow bowl of tuning fluid by a fraction of a millimeter. The silver liquid inside trembled, forming a fleeting ripple before settling perfectly flat. This was his morning ritual. As a civilian archivist for the High Guild, maintaining absolute ambient neutrality was not just a preference, it was a biological imperative. The Kryn were beings of living, resonant crystal. Their translucent bodies caught the soft ambient light of the chamber, refracting it in gentle hues of violet and cyan. To them, architecture was an extension of their nervous system. Into this delicate equilibrium walked Sarah Jenkins. She was an acoustic nightmare. The human engineer moved with a heavy, fleshy thudding that sent microscopic tremors through the polished stone floor. Kale watched her from his desk, his internal facets dimming with unease. He couldn't understand why the guild had hired an earth contractor to repair the sublevel thermal vents. Humans were notoriously clumsy. More perplexing, however, was the apparatus she wore on her head. Two thick, synthetic black shells clamped firmly over her ears, connected by a rigid band. Kale assumed they were some kind of sensory deprivation punishment device. Why else would a species willingly cut themselves off from the sacred acoustic web of their surroundings? If you have ever wondered what true silence actually costs, you will want to hear exactly how this ends. Keep listening. A sharp, rhythmic clicking. Then the heavy scrape of a toolbox. Kale winced, his outer skin clouding over. The translucent crystal of his forearm turned a milky, opaque white as his internal harmonics began to frantically oscillate. Sarah had just set her metal toolkit down directly against the base of a central load-bearing pillar. The metallic clack reverberated through the vaulted chamber. It was a minor impact, perhaps 40 decibels, but in the guild, it was a physical blow. Kale hurried over, his movements fluid and completely silent. He gestured wildly toward the pillar, trying to explain the danger without raising his voice above a breathless whisper. He told her that Kryn architecture was interwoven with their biology. A sudden, sharp noise did not just hurt their ears. It vibrated their very lattice structure. A loud enough sound was a literal death sentence, capable of shattering them from the inside out. Sarah blinked at him, her lips moving as she spoke, though the thick black shells over her ears remained firmly in place. She reached up, tapping the side of one shell, and offered a simple thumbs up. The gesture made absolutely no sense. Kale retreated to his desk, staring at her. This was the partial truth he could not reconcile. If human bodies were soft, porous, and unaffected by resonance, why were they so careless with an element that could wipe out an entire city? Did they simply lack the capacity to understand acoustic danger? The unease settled over Kale like a heavy blanket. He returned to his archival duties, keeping one eye on the human. For the next hour, the chamber returned to its serene state. Sarah worked quietly at the base of the pillar, her hands moving over the vent access panels with surprising dexterity. The tuning fluid on Kale's desk remained undisturbed, a perfect mirror of silver. Then, the ambient lighting in the chamber flickered. It was a subtle shift, a drop from a warm violet to a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Kale's cranial ridges tightened. The air pressure in the room dropped suddenly, popping in his auditory canals. A deep, subsonic rumble began to roll upward from the sublevels. The tuning fluid on his desk did not just ripple. It violently separated, forming jagged spikes of liquid that danced aggressively in the center of the bowl. Which meant the structural integrity was already compromised. The primary power core in the lower levels was experiencing a catastrophic feedback loop. Kale knew the protocol. The visual alarms flared first, bathing the vaulted ceilings in rhythmic pulses of crimson light. But the visual warnings were merely a courtesy. The true defense mechanism of the guild was the emergency siren system. Designed to instantly incapacitate any organic or synthetic threat, the acoustic array was calibrated to unleash a solid wall of 140 decibels of sustained, piercing sound. For a Kryn, it was meant to be deployed only when evacuation was impossible and the destruction of the facility was imminent. It was a localized kill zone. The subsonic rumble built into an audible whine. The floor vibrated beneath Kale's feet with such violence that the dust on the floor began to form perfect, geometric patterns of impending destruction. His joints locked. His crystalline structure paralyzed itself in an automatic defense mechanism, trying to brace for the incoming shockwave. Across the room, two other archivists collapsed to their knees, their bodies turning entirely white with terror. But Sarah didn't even look up from her diagnostic screen. The human was still kneeling by the vent, her wrench turning smoothly, completely isolated inside her synthetic black shells. The whine of the charging sirens hit a deafening pitch, peeling the paint off the lower bulkheads. The air itself became a physical weight, pressing down on Kale's chest as the final safety relay snapped open. The audible whine escalated into a physical wall of force. 140 decibels. The sound did not just enter Kale's auditory canals, it gripped his crystalline spine. Microfractures spiderwebbed across the vaulted ceiling above them. Dust rained down in thick, choking sheets. Two massive resonating pillars nearest the thermal vent cracked down the middle with a sickening snap. Kale could not cover his ears to block it out. Kryn biology did not allow for flexible joints during a rigid defensive lockdown. He was going to shatter entirely. They all were. The guild was collapsing under the weight of its own security system. Through the blinding, localized pain, Kale watched the human. Sarah Jenkins stood up. She did not clutch her head in agony. She did not fall to the floor in a defensive posture. She merely swiped a layer of gray dust from the front of her denim coveralls. Kale's internal facets glowed with absolute, logic-defying bewilderment. The acoustic array was literally tearing the ancient stone architecture apart around her, pulverizing the very air. Kale stared at her soft, fleshy frame, finally understanding that the porous, water-filled composition of the human body didn't resist the kinetic energy of sound waves by turning rigid, but rather absorbed and dissipated the lethal acoustic force like a sponge soaking up a spill. Her bones were dense calcium coated in thick layers of muscle, not fragile geometric lattices. A sound that could vibrate a Kryn into dust merely caused a mild, perhaps slightly uncomfortable vibration in a human chest cavity. Sarah walked right past the collapsing pillars. She moved directly into the epicenter of the sonic kill zone, her boots crunching over the shattered remains of decorative acoustic baffles. She approached the exposed power relay of the siren system mounted on the far wall. She gripped the heavy manual override lever. It was jammed firmly in place by the structural shifting of the stone. She braced her heavy work boot against the primary console, took a breath, and simply pulled backward with raw, brute kinetic force. The thick metal snapped. The primary power cable tore loose in a shower of blue sparks. Silence slammed into them. It was sudden and absolute. Kale dropped heavily to his hands and knees, gasping for air as his crystalline body finally unlocked from its rigid state. He looked up at the human, expecting her to finally show signs of internal trauma. She was just rubbing the grease off her hands with a rag. She reached up and pulled the thick black shells off her ears, letting them rest casually around her neck. Which meant they were armor. They were not punishment devices at all. She walked over to her canvas tool bag, kicked a piece of rubble out of her path, and retrieved a dented thermal flask covered in faded adhesive stickers. She popped the lid. The sharp, bitter scent of earth coffee drifted into the sterile, ozone-tinged air. She took a long, slow sip of the dark liquid, completely undisturbed. Sarah exhaled loudly, shaking her head. It was getting a little pitchy anyway, she said casually, her voice sounding impossibly loud in the dead quiet of the ruined hall. Kale forced himself into a sitting position, his outer shell still milky white with residual shock. He pointed a trembling, translucent finger at the heavy black cups hanging around her neck. He asked what kind of divine, military-grade acoustic shielding they possessed to protect her from total cellular disintegration. Sarah laughed. She tapped the plastic casing with a dirty fingernail. She explained they were just basic noise-canceling headphones. They didn't protect her body from the pressure waves, they just protected her delicate eardrums from ringing later. Her body took the brunt of the impact naturally. Kale realized then the terrifying depth of human engineering and resilience. They did not adapt their environment to be perfectly, uniformly safe. They built localized, highly specific shields for their weakest points and simply walked straight into the hazard. And Sarah, looking down at the cracked pillars and the trembling archivist, realized for the very first time just how incredibly fragile her pristine, glowing employers really were. It was a mutual, terrifying revelation of biological extremes. Kale remained slumped against his desk, watching the human sweep up the shattered remains of priceless tuning crystals like common refuse. The black shells hung loosely around her neck, no longer an instrument of sensory deprivation, but a brilliant, brutal symbol of survival. She hummed a low, erratic tune under her breath, completely unaware that she had just walked through an apocalypse.